So thanks all for joining us today. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor here at the School of International Public Affairs, and I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. We have a great lineup this evening to talk about the outlook for New York State's renewable energy targets and goals and aspirations with some people who are key to making that happen. Let me first say that this event, like all those at the center, is being webcast live. Full video recording and a podcast will be available on our website and on iTunes in the coming days. For those who are watching online, when we turn to the discussion with the audience, you're free to participate and encouraged to participate as well. Through Twitter, through our hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. As I said, we have a great lineup of speakers today. Let me just briefly tell you who's here. Knut Aanstad is the president of Statoil Wind. Many of you know Statoil just won a large offshore wind lease off of Long Island that I'm sure he'll talk about. So he's the head of business development activities within offshore wind in Statoil. Extensive experience in international oil and gas business since 2006, has been involved in all aspects of Statoil's offshore wind projects. In 2012, he served as special advisor to the UN Secretary General's Esty for All initiative. Dan Esty, known to many of you, a professor at Yale Law School, has been a professor since 1994 with stints in government, including 3 years as the Commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the author of numerous books like the prize-winning Green to Gold, not a really smart guy with degrees from Harvard, a Rhodes Scholar, and Yale Law School, and is a strategy advisor to Hydro-Quebec. Richard Kauffman is the energy czar of New York. I don't know if you like that or don't like that title, but that's what everyone calls him. So formerly the chairman of energy and finance for New York, the chair of NYSERDA board. He joined the administration of Governor Cuomo after serving in the administration of President Obama, the Department of Energy, where we had the chance to work together. He leads New York's comprehensive Reforming the Energy Vision initiative, and basically oversees and manages all aspects of New York's energy portfolio. Eric Martel is the president and CEO of Hydro-Quebec, took office as president and CEO in July 2015, and prior to this worked at Bombardier from 2002 to 2015. And then Vijay is well known to many of you, a professor here at the engineering school, a member of the faculty steering committee of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and has studied at some length the dynamics within New York State and what it looks like to try to integrate more and more renewables into the grid. So he'll talk a bit about that. So the way this is going to work is we are first going to hear 7 minutes and 13 seconds of remarks, because I think if you're more precise, people are more likely to take the numbers seriously. 7 minutes and 13 seconds of remarks each from Richard Kauffman, and then from Eric, and then from Knut. And after those opening comments, we're going to move to a moderated discussion, bring Dan and Vijay into the conversation, have a bit of a conversation and dialogue amongst ourselves, and I'll encourage people to actively jump in and engage and ask one another questions, and then we will open it up to you all to ask questions both in the room and online as well. So thanks all for being here. Please join me in welcoming our speakers and guests, and I'll turn it over to Richard. Thank you.
All right, so tell me when I'm got my 13 seconds left. Okay, I'm going to talk fast. So thank you all very much for being here, and thanks to Jason for organizing this. So New York State, we have 50% renewable mandate by 2030. And we're not going to be able to achieve that goal on a cost-effective basis, or maybe even in time, if we keep doing things the old way. And the old way is just bolting things onto the grid of Tesla and Westinghouse that grid was never intended to do. So that grid was never intended to have renewables on it, never intended to have distributed resources. So if we want to do things differently, we need to build a different kind of grid, and that grid is the grid that you've all seen the pictures of for a long time, the grid of the future. It's a two-way grid. Supply and demand are dynamic. It has a relationship between has distributed resources and still central station production and distribution. And we have not been building that grid. And the reason we've not been building that grid is we've had a set of policies that have really been designed to keep rebuilding the old grid. And so really when you boil REV down, what it's trying to do is to set up a market-based principle to drive capital to build this grid of the future. And so there are really three principles which underlie our policy and which we believe will drive capital to build the grid of the future. And the good news, when I talk about capital, is that the grid, the current grid, is not only energy inefficient, and that's not a surprise because it was never designed to be energy efficient, but it is financially very inefficient. And as one number, the average capacity utilization of the system is about a little over 50%, and that number is declining. And so in the last 35 years, there's been a revolution in other capital-intensive industries in order to compete globally, but that revolution has not occurred in the utility sector because the utility sector has been protected by regulation. So the good news is that we can build this new grid largely using the cost envelope of what we're paying today. So the three elements, quickly. The first is locational value for distributed resources. And we're already in the process of having a successor to net metering. Because after all, where are you going to have distributed resources on the grid? We know they're supposed to have distributed resources. They have some value in some places of the grid that's much more than in others. We want to drive through price signals the distributed resources in those parts of the grid where it'll have the most value. So that's number one. Number two, the locational value is great as a price signal. But in New York State, for utilities, it has nothing to do with utility compensation. In New York State, utilities are just wires companies. They get cost recovery based upon the capital that they deploy historically. We must change the economic model for the utilities, migrating away from the traditional rate-based perspective, because rate-basing leads to spending on capital. So it's not surprising we have a system which is very capital efficient. Rate basing leads to, as a disincentive to deployment of new technology, because IT, for example, may not be a capital expenditure at all, or it's a replacement for conventional capital. So what utility, it's not a fault of the utilities, it's how we have regulated them. And so, then the third is that we must change this rate basing approach leads to actually utilities not partnering with DER solutions in certain locations, because to the contrary, it's in those locations where the utility otherwise would have a financial incentive to keep spending capital. And the good news here is that 93 to 94% of a customer bill is a pass-through cost where up to now the utility has earned no profit. So the opportunity for utilities to actually earn a share of savings by helping customers reduce energy costs is a huge opportunity. So when utilities worry about their future business model, there's a lot of value to go after. And the third point is, the third principle is about competitive markets. It's really important to have robust competitive markets because it's the competitive markets that are going to bring innovation. They're going to find the projects. And this takes me to the last point on why competitive markets are important. When we think about this new grid, it has to have an IT infrastructure on top of everything else. And how are you going to build an IT infrastructure unless you have a good, robust connection to market participants? Because the IT infrastructure needs to integrate these distributed resources. It needs to balance the load and do all this other stuff. And so if you think about your iPhone, Apple doesn't develop all the apps. It has a platform. There's a connection between Apple and the app developers, so Apple knows how to spend the money on the platform. And that's why we need to have that robust competitive market. So I hope you see how the pieces fit together. We're going to drive capital because we're going to drive capital to the locations of the grid through price signals. That's where the DER is going to be. We're changing the financial incentives to the utilities, so the utilities have an incentive to adopt new technologies, to adjust the load. And we have robust competitive markets that will help create the market mechanism for the IT system. Thank you. How'd I do?
That was good. I don't know. I have no idea. I was.
I thought it was at school. I thought I was going to get a good grade.
Thank you, Richard. Eric, let me turn it over to you.
can I use Richard's time left or?
Yeah, it's some time.
So good evening, everybody. So thanks for being here. We were very happy to be having the chance to participate to this forum tonight. So let me tell you just as a start a little bit more about Hydro-Quebec, because I'm sure you know the name, but just in a bit of a summary. So we have a different model, I would say, in Quebec to manage our electricity. Hydro-Quebec is a complete integrator. So we are managing production, and we are also doing transmission, but also distribution. So we're doing distribution. We have 4.2 million customers. Smart meter is also installed for about 3.8 million of them, which creates the same opportunity Richard was referring to, and I'll mention that a little later. But in a nutshell, we have 82 production facility, pretty much all hydro. We have access to 42,000 megawatt of hydro, so large project out there that we've been building over the years. And, so we're not in different sources of energy. We're basically a hydro capability unit in Quebec. We have large reservoir that, give us the opportunity to stock water for a long time in certain period of the year, but which may become available, for us, especially during winter. And I'll mention that because we do need a lot of power in Quebec during winter, but despite that, we use probably 12 days a year. We're getting close to use our capacity, but the remaining of the year, that energy is available and that power is also available, especially, with places like New York or Boston or Toronto for us. Because the demand is happening at a different time during the year, so it's an interesting also to take this into consideration. We also have about 3,500 megawatt of wind capacity in our system, and again, 99% of the energy we're producing is coming from renewables. So this puts us in a very nice position, of course, with the situation happening. And to be honest, we made that choice in the 60s, and we probably got lucky because I think at the time we were hesitating between nuclear and hydro. We were able to do both. I don't think we anticipated the needs, for so much renewable at the time, but we ended up, as I said, probably a little bit of luck into that, making probably what we believe today was clearly the right choice. Hydro-Quebec can produce about 220, depending on water, of course, every year, but on average, on a regular year, about 220 terawatt hours of energy. We are, exporting about 30 to 35, depending, what year and on the market. Our main customer right now are 50% of that goes to New England. About 25% of those export are coming here in New York, and of course the remaining between Ontario and New Brunswick in Canada. We do have, similar challenge, I think, Richard was mentioning, despite our situation. And one thing I did not mention, we're in a very fortunate situation with our source, but also on pricing. Our people in Quebec pay 7.9 cents Canadian, at the bill they're getting at home for their residential. So we have the lowest rate in North America, and this is probably based on our volume and our situation today. But we are facing similar challenge I was mentioning. Electrification of transport is a big thing for us, as we don't have oil in our province. Digitalization, Richard mentioned that, is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for us with the smart meter to better manage the load of the whole network. And for us, being the all distributor for the whole province, we are integrating everything and, being able to manage and maximizing, the efficiency of how we're managing this. And the other situation also that we're facing is decentralization. Despite our lowest rate, it's happening. It's going to happen probably later in our case. We do evaluate. We have a study that says in 23, 25, people will start adapting a bit more, with the need of producing their own electricity. But, we need to be ready for that. And that's creating the opportunity of making more energy available for export at the same time. So new opportunities are emerging today, a lot of new opportunities. Everybody has very strong desire to move forward to decarbonize the energy sector. Richard was mentioning the 50% target by 2030, which is very ambitious, but probably I'm sure feasible. You know, we see a lot of market mechanism being put in place right now, changes, law being changed to adapt that new, you know, situation. It's creating opportunity for us at Hydro-Quebec because we do have, you know, a lot of energy available today without building anything, which creates that opportunity for us. And when I say for us, it's an opportunity that can be a win-win for all of us. Because one thing that's very important, a lot of people ask me, and maybe somebody's going to ask me again tonight, you know, is it better to go with wind? Is it better to go with solar? Where does hydropower stand? We are offering a different product. And I think that if we all work together and are smart together, and we look at the Northeast together, we can do a lot more renewable if we use all the sources that are available, that are becoming available. And I think, you know, some of these sources, you know, like wind and solar are becoming much more productive in terms of, and much more efficient on costs. Our model is also working extremely well. Our hydro has the uniqueness of being a non-variable source because of the large reservoir we have. You know, if you need power here in Manhattan, we can bring it down in milliseconds, you know, and it's always there available 24/7, you know, 365 days a year. So, which makes our source unique. It's a renewable source, but not a variable source and always available. So if you combine a source like this with the other renewable product that exists on the market, we can do a large amount of renewable together because we can be back, you know, guaranteeing the renewable energy availability at all the time, working with the other possibilities. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, Hydro-Quebec has strong interest, of course, in being a partner here in New York, in New York's clean energy future. Our hydroelectricity is available today, but new transmission infrastructure also will be needed for New York to maximize the benefit of our source. And, you know, we are, I think it's important to mention that decision, of course, to invest in large transmission infrastructure are important. I'm sure we all know that there is the CHP project, which is already permitted, ready to build. And I think, you know, we're looking forward to work with all our partners to be able to make it happen. And, of course, support our customer here in New York to help them achieving their plans. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Eric. Knut, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to show a lengthy presentation.
Are you putting on the Ranger Senators game? Because then we could stick around longer.
I wish. I wish. And of course, I'm hoping today for my Norwegian friend Zuccarello to score a couple of goals. But we'll get back to that after this meeting. So I'll try to keep within my minutes here. I'm going to talk to you today about the new kid on the block in a way, the new large-scale, affordable, renewable energy generation that so far has not been available to the U.S. First, a couple of words about the company, Statoil. We're a publicly traded Norwegian energy company. Majority owned by the Norwegian state, but traded in New York and Oslo. Our legacy is offshore oil and gas from Norway. That's where we were born and bred. We've grown internationally out of that Norwegian legacy position into many markets internationally. Our biggest market right now is the US, where we have invested a little bit over $30 billion over the years, and employ close to 1,000 people. We're present in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico, onshore oil, onshore gas, and we also supply a healthy portion of gas into the New York market. In Statoil, we believe that the world's energy systems are changing, and we believe that this transition in the global energy systems to a low-carbon society creates new business opportunities. And on the back of that, we've established a new business area called New Energy Solutions to drive further growth for the company into that space. And it was a natural choice for us to start that growth in the offshore wind space, because that's an environment with reasonably high barriers for entry and an environment that we know well from our heritage in Norway. And the ambition is to grow this business and to grow this primarily within offshore wind, also within other renewable energy segments, and also into the venture space. And the ambitions that we've stated internationally is to have about 15 to 20% of our annual investments into the renewable energy space by 2030. So we feel that's an ambitious but realistic target. Before I dive into the New York project, just a little bit about our history in the offshore wind space. And I've been extremely lucky because I've been able to follow this since the inception back in 2005, 2006, when we bought into our first 300 megawatt development project in the UK. Followed that through into operation, and we now operate that project, deliver about 1 terawatt hour to the UK market annually. Grown further into another project in the UK, the Dudgeon project, a 400 megawatt project, and I think it's worth mentioning sort of the magnitude of some of these projects. I mean, we are about this year to complete the construction of that project. It's taken about 5 million hours directly involved in the construction, and you can probably add another 5 million hours from the indirect hours from other people supporting the project. 4,000 vessel days. It's a massive industrial project with significant positive effects on the economies in Europe. We've also done a project, or we are doing also a project same size in Germany together with E.ON. Back in 2009, we also built the world's first floating offshore wind turbine, and we've developed that on. We're now building the world's first floating offshore wind farm in Scotland, 30 megawatt wind farm that will be commissioned later this year. The offshore wind industry has, over these 10 years, gone through a fantastic development. We've built probably now about 15 gigawatts altogether in Northwest Europe, and we've seen cost improvements that nobody had dreamt of when we started. And a clear sign of that was the last auction that took place in Germany just weeks ago, where some of the winning bids were actually bidding no subsidies at all. So the German governments provide the grid connection, and the developers will just produce their power to the market without any long-term PPAs with the government. And that's going from a place where they had close to $150, $160 per megawatt hour in terms of long-term power price, to just playing this straight into the market without subsidies. So we have just recently set our eyes on the US market. We believe that's the next frontier for offshore wind. And let's see if I can make this work. Yes, extremely pleased with having succeeded in the federal lease sale in New York in December 2016, where we won the rights to develop this area that you can see just south of Long Island. It's an area big enough to hold a wind farm larger than 1 gigawatt altogether, which could supply up to 4 terawatt hours of power straight into the doorstep of consumers on Long Island and New York City. Located 14 to 30 miles offshore. The total size of the area about 80,000 acres, and water depths 65 to 130 feet. First milestone for us is to deliver a site assessment plan to the federal government in about a year's time. And then we will just have a lot of development work to do, a lot of permitting work to do. And if successful, we might be in a position to take investment decision on this project in the early 20s. So that's the task that we have ahead of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Knut. Let me get reactions now to those 3 sets of comments from Dan and Vijay. Reactions to what you heard, and just your broader thoughts on kind of the outlook for the aggressive renewable targets here in New York and what role offshore wind and hydro will play in it.
So I think you've heard three presentations that reveal that you've gathered us at an incredibly critical moment. We might even say an auspicious moment, and not just because the Mets won last night and the Yankees lost. But more broadly, I think we're seeing three revolutions unfold all at once and all very quickly. And in that regard, again, you've heard this, but I'll just try to crystallize it. One is a commitment to a clean energy future that is now, I think, gathering momentum despite what might be going on in Washington. We have the Paris 2015 climate change agreement that requires countries, 195 of which showed up to sign this agreement, 188 of whom have developed nationally determined contributions to a decarbonized future. So it's requiring people to move from ambition to operation. And I think what you heard was the movement towards operationalizing the shift to a clean energy future. And I consider that to be a very big deal. And the question is, how do we go from talk to action? And I think, Jason, thank you for gathering us to have that conversation. Number two, I think you see a dramatic shift, which Richard is leading in New York and others are following in other places, in the business model of electricity. And the New York REV process, R-E-V, and that process in New York, but a similar process in California and Massachusetts and Connecticut, is, I think, fundamentally shifting the incentive framework that faces people in the power generation world, as well as the transmission and distribution world. And I think we are seeing significant shifts. And third, I think we are seeing a shift in the energy policy arena, where this was a world dominated by the federal government in the United States for many decades. The federal government has been backing off for a number of years and is now in full retreat from leadership on energy policy. But I think stepping into that vacuum are a number of states. New York, again, lead among them. And I think the question is, what is the policy framework that is going to be put in place to get us to this clean energy future? And I think there are ideas emerging, there's conversations going on, but all the details haven't been worked out. And I consider that to be fundamental and critical to the possibilities of success in delivering on these very ambitious global goals, national goals, and, as Richard's pointed out, state-level goals. These are extremely ambitious goals in terms of decarbonization, bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, ramping up renewable energy. And I will just give you a couple of quick thoughts on that. First, it's going to take a portfolio approach. It's going to require a lot of solar, a lot of wind, and a lot of hydro, as well as dramatic investments in energy efficiency and a smarter grid that makes all of this work more efficiently. So that's point one. Point two, I think it's going to require a different pricing model, and you heard hints of that already. But I think the future depends on energy markets paying people not just for energy and capacity, but for the attribute of being decarbonized. And we don't have that in place. We need it in place. And there's some hints of it in the clean energy standard that's coming out of New York, but frankly, not fully there yet. And Richard can come back at me if he wants. But I think the policy begins, but is not yet sharply defined, particularly to the extent that there is an assumption on the part of the state of New York that prior commitments of clean energy will continue to be sold into the state of New York without compensating people for the attribute of decarbonization. I think you've got to move to a clean market that has energy capacity and attributes of clean energy. And finally, I would say all of this is going to require an extraordinary commitment to innovation. Not just innovation in bringing new technologies to bear, but frankly, innovation in policy, innovation in incentives, innovation in finance, innovation in public engagement. And one of the things, again, I think you see emerging in the conversation here is innovation in partnerships. I actually don't think wind and solar and hydro compete. I think they are complements in meeting the clean energy needs of New York and New England. And in fact, if I were to be the czar for a day, taking Richard's title, but even higher level, I would promote a regional strategy, New York, New England-wide strategy, linked tightly not only to Quebec but to the maritime provinces, and understand the enormous efficiency possibility and complementarity that was hinted at very briefly, which is that the Canadian provinces are winter peakers, we are summer peakers, and the ability to use that capacity that they have in excess in the summer in New York and New England when we air condition would be an extraordinary thing. And I'll just close by saying it won't happen unless New York leads the way.
Thank you. So thank you. The question about these complementary forms of energy, bringing hydro, solar, and wind all into the New York grid, aggressive renewable targets in New York. Vijay, let me turn it over to you. You've looked a bit at the ability to scale up renewables to that extent. What do you see as the opportunity, and what are some of the challenges policymakers need to be thinking about?
So, first of all, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with such distinguished people here. So I'm an engineer, so not quite a policy person, but I see the goal as how can we get there with the lowest amount of public funds, right? Public funds are scarce, and how do we get there? And so, and in the long run, in the short run, something may be more expensive, but that may turn out to be good in the long run. And I think that's what, you are doing, and it's so. Some of the, and we are in a sort of, I find that we are in a little bit put in a stranger position because of this really low gas prices. Right? So what would have been, perhaps, even though that's not something, it would have been a very different job if 10 years ago, what they thought would be the gas prices were actually the gas prices today. Right? So that's we are in an interesting situation. Now, I very much agree with what Hydro-Quebec and what Dan just said about, but the goal is 50% renewables, including that for heating, and I think electrification of heating will have to occur if we want to drive emissions down. Electrifications of transport may also occur, and I think if our work kind of is focused on that. If truly we go in that direction, then actually New York will become a winter peaker. And I think, so there are both opportunities there, right? One is, first of all, I think the utility, at least for the initial deployment of so heat pumps, which are electric heating devices, will actually benefit because the load factor would improve. You are pushing more electricity through the same infrastructure. But once you go much beyond that, what we need to do, that's an interesting question. Interestingly, by the way, wind is better aligned in the winter for the winter heating. However, one of the sort of issues that I worry about is that as we scale these up, demand for a lot of the public thinks of only storage, right? Maybe pumped hydro or batteries, but we will also need to exploit flexibility, where in the days, one day or few hours that something is not available, what can we do? So for example, if we think very long term and everybody starts to install electric heat pumps, should we actually provide incentives to keep your backup gas boiler, right? Because that can actually provide a lot of flexibility to the system, where that backup gas boiler comes on when the grid cannot handle the electricity. And now sort of works is suggesting when we look at climate data, weather data, that that's not going to happen very frequently. In fact, it may happen less than a couple of 100 hours a year, but when it happens, if you don't have that backup, you are in, so that's one. The other thing is a sort of question I have is, we heard that in Quebec, they pay 7.9 cents retail, is what I heard. Mm-hmm. Here, the retail is more like 2.5 times that, right? So I think while we are doing the battle over what I call 2 cents, and why did I pick that number? Our colleagues at Statoil and Shell, in long, deep large-scale offshore will make it happen at 5 cents in a few years, I think. And it's already there in Europe, and gas at 3 cents. So I'm just picking this magical 2-cent number. While we pay the utility like 13 cents to bring that electricity to you, right? Do we see the possibilities either of efficiency in that 13 cents, or do we see something like, what I hear from the subway people that, signaling is going to cost so much because it's 80 years old. Will the utility come up with those? Are those surprises buried in the ground? And does the public need to know about those surprises so that we can be very sort of clear about our choices? So there's just a couple of thoughts.
Great, thank you. So just a couple of questions, and I hope we make it interactive. If you guys have questions of one another, please jump in. We have not only a lot of people, but a lot of expertise among the people who are in the room. So I want to make sure to turn to questions quickly. But maybe, Richard, I could just go back to you and your reactions to any of the comments you've heard, and broader question of just, in your view, what are the greatest risk factors to REV?
Well, I think that if I could just maybe respond immediately to Vijay, because he's sitting right next to me. So I think that he's, of course, right in all the things he said, and I think it goes to the point about the risk. We've got to get started, right? And what I would say is that I go back to this point about how incredibly inefficient the system is from an energy and financial standpoint. And that's really the good news about how we can get started on stuff. And so I'll just give you, and we have. So I just want to give you maybe a couple of quick examples. Over time, we're going to get much better granular pricing, much better knowledge about in the grid where something is worth. But today, and this is true not just in New York, it's true everywhere, utilities know where there's a grid constraint. Okay? That doesn't require a lot of high tech. And utilities also know when they need to spend capital, either low growth, which is not very often, only about 30% of the time, or replacement capital. You don't need high tech for that either. So we've had one large example in Brooklyn and Queens where Con Ed was going to spend over $1 billion on a new substation, where rather than doing that as a business as usual, because our policy, they opened up a solicitation for what we're calling non-wires alternatives. Although I think we've changed the name because there's a rap group called NWA, which I don't know. So we're calling it something else. Maybe it's non-wire solutions now, I think. Whatever. And so what came back were a couple $100 million of the costs were going to be a couple $100 million rather than over $1 billion, because it had energy efficiency, some storage, demand response, CHP. And so all customers would save money, a lot of money, because less peak power in addition to less capital, and it would have fewer emissions. So we know that that can work, and that's been replicated slowly with some other utilities. But actually, we should do this all the time as a process. And there's a number between $1 and $1.2 billion where this can happen regularly. So the system is not set up for that. I'm talking about the business model, the regulatory model is not set up. But you can imagine that kind of world where we get going right away and see, rather than a religious debate, every time the utility has to spend capital in a grid-constrained area, let's see what comes back from the market. But it's a very different regulatory model. So we can get started with that. Second thing really relates to this issue about public dollars, which Vijay talked about. We've already started on this too, and we started with offshore wind, which is the point that let's think about how states, for example, can spend dollars, public dollars, stretch more dollars by finding out where there's a intervention which can unlock markets, really related to soft costs as opposed to hard costs. And that's something, again, that we are doing, but it's actually a difficult part, because that's the point of maximum leverage where government can intervene in markets, right where the market is just not. But it's a risky place for government to be. Are we, doing crony capitalism? How do we know that the government intervention wouldn't have otherwise, already occurred? Stuff would have happened without the government intervention. And the other thing is politicians, they want to announce a project. They don't want to announce the fact that they've been an enabler of a market. So we have that too. So those are just a couple of thoughts that we can get going with a lot of stuff because we're dealing with a system where there's a lot of inefficiency in capital and inefficiency in processes relative to other industries.
In terms of the things to get going, can you talk a little bit about how much new transmission is needed to meet the governor's goal,
Well,
particularly Champlain Hudson that came up, and then also what role storage will play too?
Well, okay, so there's a couple things. So, first, obviously, we're going to need more transmission, but we got to get for the point about energy efficiency. We got to get a lot more energy efficiency. And one of the problems when I talk about sort of public dollars and utility incentives and so forth, the way that we in New York and most places, energy efficiency has not been a business for the utilities. It's a matter of regulatory compliance. Demand response is a matter of regulatory compliance. It's not a business. Here, the utilities up to now, have just passed through 50% of the bill, which is the cost of energy. We should be delighted to have utilities earn a share of savings on power. When, Jim Rogers, wanted to have megawatt contracts, we could do megawatt contracts in New York State. Utilities just have to come forward and propose it, but it's a different business model for them. This is a case where the private sector is lagging the policy space that's been created for them. Storage. So again, of course, we're going to have storage. So the issue here, again, in a market-based approach, and this is where the system needs to change in terms of it's not just the utilities and government, but some of the innovative energy companies need to change too, because the storage companies come to us and say, "Why can't you be? You gave all this money to the solar industry. Why don't you do the same thing for the storage industry? Why can't you be like California and have a storage mandate?" Well, really? Because it's the problem. How do we know whether the answer is actually one kind of storage versus another? And we already have a capital inefficient and energy inefficient system. There's got to be places for storage. Let's think about how we can use the existing cost envelope of the bill. It's much harder to think about deploying solar in that context, as opposed to just being a mandate. So again, it involves a different kind of engagement because we're trying to change a system of systems as opposed to just extracting storage and using public dollars to fund a particular program.
So I'm going to turn to one or two other topics in a minute, but just sort of, reactions to that. Eric and Knut, how does that strike you as you think about selling power into New York State?
You want me to go first? Yeah. So clearly, I think I would agree that infrastructure, will definitely be needed to support everything else. So we were talking about flexibility. So project like CHP or others brings also that flexibility. I will try to summarize and let's imagine a 400 megawatt hour, wind farm that provides all the energy to the grid that they can provide. But the morning that they can only provide 100, you need a backup. You need something that's going to do that, and something that is, could be a renewable source like hydropower or others. But clearly, we think infrastructure will be needed in terms of how we finance that, how we do that. And we need to look at what's been done in the past. There's an example here. We've built a 1,500 kilometer, like 1,000-mile line going from La Baie James straight to Cindy Point, which is nearby Boston. This was in the 80s. We brought technology, innovation. This was the first multi-DC terminal in the world being built. So it was an engineering challenge at the time, but we did it. We did that with the people here, and that line today is fully amortized, fully paid 30 years later. People had a vision. They saw it. Of course, it was a challenge at the beginning, and infrastructure costs money at the beginning. Our entire network today has cost a fortune to build. But today, the predictability on pricing is amazing because it's all about amortization. I can, sign a contract today for 20 years, 30 years, which other industry can't, because we know it's about amortizing our costs for the next 30 years or 40 years, and it brings predictability. So as a state or as a province, if you're an investor and look at that state and say, oh, they can predict the cost of their electricity for the next 30 or 40 years, that's also very important to think about that. So yes, infrastructure are needed. They cost a lot of money usually at the beginning, but then after you enjoy them, and that's been our experience for a long time.
Maybe add a comment on the
Maybe pull that
regulatory. Sorry,
closer.
comment on the regulatory side of this. We've seen this in all the markets we've played in Europe, in Germany with their Energiewende, and in the UK with their energy market reform. They've had to change their regulations in order to accommodate the volumes of renewables that we've been able to put into those markets. And I think it's also fair to say that the only reason why they've been able to accommodate as much renewable into the market as they have is the way they've been interconnected. So that Denmark, for instance, can at days be 100% powered by wind. But when the wind doesn't blow, they're interconnected with hydropower from Norway, hydropower from Sweden, coal from Germany. It's a well interconnected system. But still, these interconnections and these the regulatory side of this still has to be developed even further, because there's so much to be how shall I put it, so much to be gained by enabling us to provide even more renewables into the market, as we see the cost has come down to the level where they're at now in Europe. We're actually in some countries, we believe that offshore wind is the cheapest alternative into the market.
You talked in your comments about some of the permitting hurdles that still lie ahead for you. Are you concerned about the outlook for offshore wind given changes in the U.S. administration?
We've just embarked on this permitting side. I think the greatest challenge for us on the permitting side is the lack of predictability. And that lack of predictability on the timing creates a challenge when we are to bid our projects into a market, because the market needs clarity on when they can expect this power to be available to them. And we cannot provide that clarity as long as we don't have predictability on the permitting side of things.
Yeah, I think unpredictability in government may continue. Just guessing. That may be something you have to figure out how to deal with.
I don't know. I think you're actually seeing states step up. So you've got unpredictability and poor performance at certain levels, but you've got, I think, a number of states that are demonstrating great creativity. And I think that actually shows a lot of promise. Connecticut developed a green bank. New York now has a green bank. The role here is to provide some predictability and to de-risk the flow of private capital into the projects, the infrastructure that needs to be built. And I think that's providing a pathway to what Vijay told us is key, which is to use the minimum amount of public money to get this done. And I think these new models are limited public resources leveraging private capital to potentially great effect.
Could I just intervene on this for a second? Because I agree with what's just been said. So the issue here, and again, it goes to this issue about the importance to sort of change the way we've been approaching these problems, because and it requires a change of everybody. It requires a change of the whole system. So what we have done in the past in the United States relative to, say, Europe, is we have built one project at a time. So there's a tremendous effort to say, okay, we're going to build a project. And you have the developers and you have some environmental groups. Everybody's agitating to extract that one project. Well, a single project is not going to create scale. And the public dollars that are expended to build that one project, it's not clear that those are very much leverage on those dollars. So the thing that we've done when we've talked about offshore wind is to think about it differently and to think about a large economic prize. And so that's why we helped, create this offshore, with the federal government, tried to create a large space. You saw how large that is. We have collaborated with other states so that we have a multi-state approach to thinking about how much bigger the whole market can be. And so as opposed to it just being a single, small project. The other thing I want to say, though, about process, and I know that I'm being very nerdy about process, but I want to tell an offshore wind process story. Okay? Because, in fact, away from this very large project, the largest offshore wind project has just been signed off of Long Island. It's going to be 91 megawatts. It's not a very big project, but it will be the largest one that will be built in the United States. So that project's been around for a long time, but it was too expensive. So how, you're hearing that I'm very concerned about not just building a project and how can we be cost effective. So the reason that this is the story, the reason it became cost effective related to a change in process, because there were two procurements on Long Island. There was a renewable procurement that required on-island resources. So what came back from that procurement was ground-mounted solar, which was really kind of a problem on Long Island. Ground-mounted because it's cheaper than rooftop, but it was a problem on Long Island because it meant you're cutting down trees or putting solar panels on farmland. So that was not an optimal approach. The other procurement, and wind was too expensive. Offshore wind was more expensive than that. The other procurement was at the east end of Long Island was an area of grid constraint. So there was a procurement for that. And what came back for that procurement were diesel generators. Okay? So that wasn't a good answer either. So we changed the process and said, let's have a procurement that deals with both problems. And magically, offshore wind came into the frame because that power is going to come off the east end of Long Island. Change in process really, really can matter.
I'm curious, Knut, you mentioned the goal, Statoil has the ambition of 15 to 20% of new investment in renewable by 2030. What is that going to depend upon, whether that's feasible and realistic? Is that about policy to continue to drive demand, or is that about prices of gas in the global market? What's going to determine whether that happens?
I hate to say it, but it depends on my ability to create new business, I guess. Anyway, but I'd like to build a little bit on what Richard said, because I think this has a lot to do about regional cooperation, and it has to be about states taking the lead. And I think New York has done a great thing in establishing this target of 2.4 gigawatt. If you add that to the target that Massachusetts has set of 1.6 gigawatt, and if you get some of the other states, larger states like New Jersey, to throw in a gigawatt or two, that is starting to create a pipeline of projects that private capital can start investing on the back of. And we know that, for instance, companies investing into the installation vessel part of this business, and I mentioned the 4,000 vessel days on our Dudgeon project. People here in the US look at that now and say, well, hey, maybe this is a business that we actually could invest in. And of course, because of the Jones Act, there are certain limitations on what vessels we can use and what we cannot use. So this is a growing market, and it comes because of that policy lead that comes from some of these states. And again, going back to the Dudgeon project, and I mentioned the 5 million hours. That's not UK hours, that's European hours. It's a pan-European project. The offshore wind industry in Europe had not existed unless the various countries in Europe had accepted to ship turbines across from Denmark to the UK, or from Germany to the UK, or ship other elements, bits and pieces from one state to another. So we have to look at the development of a regional supply chain on the East Coast. And so it's that predictability and our ability to build that regional supply chain that can help us drive the cost down.
So people are optimistic about the policy outlook. That's good. I want to ask about maybe one other potential policy risk. Eric, the U.S.-Canadian trade relationship may be in for a bumpier ride ahead. We'll see. There's some indications of that. What impact does that have on the project?
Yeah. But clearly, you know, we don't know. I don't want to speculate right now on what's going to happen because it's been changing over days. But clearly, this is something, you know, that could affect it. And I think, you know, we're going to be monitoring the situation. But, you know, if you look at what's been said earlier, I think the leadership for buying electricity has always come from the state. And I think, you know, right now, we work with the state at the state level. Yes, you know, if a infrastructure project needs federal permit, at the end, I was mentioning an example of one project that we're interested in doing that has a federal permit already. So we could be building this. So I think at the end, you know, people will wait and probably consider all the elements here. It's not just there's a financial question, tax or things like that, but I think the benefit of keeping, you know, a free trade on energy amongst the two countries. This is the biggest trading of energy in the world between two countries, between Canada and the United States. It's significant. Changing this tomorrow will have all kind of ramification. And I think everybody understand that. And I think, you know, in our mind, our assumption today is that it's going to be staying pretty much what it is. Of course, we need to look into that. But clearly, I think this would be having major impact on both sides.
And just to expand on sort of how those impacts would play out, right? I mean, for example, the sale of natural gas, there's actually different requirements for free trade versus non-free trade agreement countries. Hypothetically, if NAFTA were upended, I mean, I guess you have the U.S.-Canadian free trade agreement to fall back on, actually. But how would it play out? Is it about the physical sales of the electricity? Is it about the supply chain for the project back and forth?
Could be about the you know, procurement, how a contract will be structured, how, you know, will there be new taxes, new incentive, you know, to do more in every country. We think it would be, you know, terrible for everybody. That's our understanding, but I don't think it's going to be, you know, our assumption, as I said, is clearly that, you know, it's going to be pretty much a status quo right now on how things are being done.
Vijay, you've looked at issues around integrating renewables into the grid, not only the daily variability, but also monthly and seasonal variability. Just talk a little bit about what that means for the challenges and what that'll look like to try to integrate renewables at a much higher level into the grid in New York.
So first of all, I think the good news there is that having this diverse sources and having, even just if I take wind, spread out across the whole state and offshore does help you a lot. Okay, so that's the good news, right? Now, indeed, you know, in that sense, wind in the northern part of the state or western part of the state, you know, bringing it into the city, there are some transmission upgrades that would be needed. Offshore has the advantage that it is closer, right? You know. But I think what is perhaps not completely thought through, in my view, and which may become a challenge, is that we may need, you know, not for 1,000 hours a year, but for 100 hours a year, 150 hours a year, dramatic reductions in either demand or some 100 hours a year when we can fire up something which is cost effective. And, you know, one has it has to be very low capital cost technology so that it is viable for 100, 200 hours a year. Right? High capital cost technologies need to have a lot more hours to amortize. So that's, you know, I think something we need to think through. And, you know, academics like to think very long term, right? So that either you are dead or you are wrong, nobody knows. So I'm thinking, like, you know, what if all of this, you know, heating and, you know, transport becomes electric? What happens? So there is both good news and bad news. The good news is actually in the near term, 10, 20 years, the load factors improve, which is good for the utility. In the long term, you have to think about it. And so I start to think about that, you know, is the last 1% of reliability costing a lot? Right? Is the last 1 or 2%. Now, we are in a country where we are totally used to like very, very high reliability. But all sorts of market and innovative ways may pop up if we allowed some differential
Right.
pricing on reliability. So those are a few
Yeah,
wanna comment on
yeah, I think it's an excellent point and it's a thought experiment, and so
That's what we do. And
so please, because this is where I could get fired here. So the thing about the phone, the wireline phone was more reliable than cell phones, right? We know that. But we've gotten used to the value that we get from distributed phone service. So the internet doesn't work all the time, right? It's, but there's a value to the architecture. So we have created this regulatory structure around the electric utility system that is a very deterministic. It's a deterministic system. It's not probabilistic in how it's put together, right? And so it's interesting when we talk about the reliability is 99 point whatever. Of course, the way that the score is kept is excluding major storms. Yes. So it's reliable, incredibly reliable until it's not, and then we have some real issues with the system. So yes, we could imagine, for example, building a system which gave people the equivalent of a generator. I'm not talking about a generator, the equivalent of a generator. We could devise a system where for a few minutes during the year, you got a couple of light bulbs on, and you could recharge your phone. We could design that system. It would be much less expensive than the system we have today, because it would incorporate, and part of the reason why that would be a good system is it would have many more distributed nodes to it, and those things are not going to be as tightly linked as the current central station production distribution system. But that is such a fundamentally different approach to how regulators think about the system, how the industry thinks about it. But this is a fantastic point that you're making. How we could get from here to there, I have no idea.
I'm thinking of the "Can you hear me now?" utility ads of the future. By the way, I wanted to ask you, Richard. It's a couple of questions coming in online, but one of them was about nuclear. So the renewable targets are toward a goal, which is greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a target for that in REV. How does shutting Indian Point affect all of that?
Okay. Well, in terms of the clean energy standards, 50% renewables is a mandate, so it's not a goal, it's a mandate by 2030. That does not include nuclear. So we have as a separate part of the clean energy standard is support for the 3 upstate nuclear plants and the way we're providing that support is through the social cost of carbon. But it's true, we've negotiated a deal with the operator of Indian Point to shut that plant down. And the reason for that really relates to safety issues, because that plant is, would never be permitted today. It's too close to, I don't think there's any other nuclear plant that's as close to a major population center, certainly in North America, if not the world. Mm-hmm. And it would just simply be impossible to evacuate people from that location, and it happens to be on a fault, and I can go on from there. So the benefit of this long-term agreement is that it gives time for the REV policies to develop, and we believe that there'll be carbon-free resources that will be able to replace that plant.
Entirely carbon-free, not natural gas.
That would be our objective, yes.
We'll open it up to questions. I think we have about 20 minutes left for questions. We have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge here. We're happy to keep going if there's no questions, but if there are, there's a microphone in the middle here, so if folks could stand up at the microphone so folks watching online could hear you, that would be helpful. Okay, we'll keep going.
So I just wanted to say, one of the things, first of all, Richard, thank you for getting Indian Point where it is. As the former commissioner in Connecticut, people asked me what I lost sleep over, and it was Indian Point, 10 miles off the western border of Connecticut, on a fault line, incredibly crowded highways and roads already. So that is an excellent thing. But it does, you have to admit, add to the challenge, because you're taking out a big block of zero carbon production, power generation, at the very same moment you're ramping up the ambition. So it does strike me as a challenge. What I think we all should spend more time on is the theme that's emerged here, which is that if we could do better peak load shaving, we would not have to invest in as much infrastructure that has this low capacity. Because, Richard, you cited a 50% capacity, but what we're hearing, and I think Vijay's made this clear, is that there's some infrastructure that's operating a few hours or a few days in the year. So this is not perhaps the best week to make this analogy, but what if you, like airlines, offer to compensate you when you're bumped off the plane? What if you were compensated when you were bumped off the grid? And you would sign up to be willing to go off the grid, perhaps even only for minutes per hour, but you'd be on a list. I mean, this is a demand response reform that we might want to build out using one of the other revolutions you talked about, which is the information technology revolution. So why not smart appliances, smart grid? You wouldn't have to think, you wouldn't have to do anything. You would simply sign up to have your refrigerator turned off 3 minutes per hour at those peak load moments. And if you got the right scale of people signed up for this, I think you could do significant peak load shaving and save enormously.
So I completely agree. And the reason why we have such a low average capacity utilization is it is in fact built for the peak. And so what Vijay talks about is a problem with, California has the duck curve. We don't have the duck curve yet because we're coming later to the party. But this point about you have a system which is getting peakier and peakier, not so much because peak demand is growing, but because of energy efficiency. And as you add energy efficiency, the base load declines, which makes the system peakier, and then you start adding, more and more renewables, and you create, you make that problem worse for the generators. So I have a tremendous amount of capital, which is not fully utilized. So you're absolutely right. There's a whole variety of things that we could do to shift load, and that's again what we're trying to do with REV. I think the question here, and this I think goes, Jason, to your question about the federal government, is how much should the utilities be involved in this as a business, which is what we think, versus how much of this is just another matter of regulatory requirement and sort of under a kind of FERC jurisdiction. So, the demand response market is a wholesale market activity. And I think that, that's a big policy uncertainty. I mean, I know what we think, and we will do everything we can to preserve our state authorities, but, we have FERC commissioners which are open.
We don't
know what we really don't know.
Sorry, does anyone have a comment on that? What is, just quickly, the question about what the change in administration means for what you're doing and for REV? Does it have any application? And how and why?
Well, we didn't start what we're doing in New York because of the federal government, the Clean Power Plan. We were starting already, really having to do with resilience issues. Sandy, Lee, and Irene, the governor, was with a bunch of cold and miserable New Yorkers in the dark. Affordability issues. We have 1 million New Yorkers that are having difficulty paying their electricity bills. And the system which is not responsive to changing customer community demands for more control over their energy and the economic development opportunities that come from the transition to a different energy economy. So those are the reasons that motivated us, and we've been using state authorities to affect our policy. So, but it would be best if we had a good partnership with the federal regulators. I mean, this sort of bifurcation between wholesale and retail markets made sense when you had just big power plants and electrons flowed in one direction. but when you talk about prosumers and, you know, electrons flowing more than one direction and, you know, that kind of line of demarcation just does not make that kind of sense anymore. But, you know, I don't know if anybody is yet willing to engage with us on that from the federal government. The federal government just had a technical conference on some of the things that we're doing in restructured markets, and it was really trying to figure out, you know, I don't know exactly what the objective was, but it's certain questions that could make us very nervous about, you know, what really is the intent of FERC in terms of a greater intervention in wholesale market activity that would have an impact on us.
I'm going to come back to that, but there was a question here. You've been waiting patiently, and then Michael Eckhart has a question. If you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Christoph Meinrich and Earth Institute. My question may be a little bit outside this intended scope. I'm just curious. I think the question is for Statoil and Hydro-Quebec mostly. If you do these long-term plans, 10, 20 years, you talked about contracts, 10, 20 years, you're doing this incredibly detailed planning for this very specific region outside Long Island. Do you ever feel the need to reach out to climate change projections and see whether the actual water in the dam or the wind blowing is going to change in 20 years?
Maybe I can answer that. We have studies with a couple of universities involved, a project called Ruanas, which actually we're working with a couple of universities, some in the US, some in Quebec, which in our case, you know, we're looking a really long time. And we believe right now climate change, you know, is a reality, clearly, and I know we're all fighting this, but there's one thing we foresee moving to the future is about 11 to 12% more water in our dam. So for us, you know, it's an add-on to our situation. Without building any new capacity, we'll be able to collect about 11 to 12% more water.
Michael, you had a question, and then there was...
Yeah.
Sorry?
Sounds like a conflict of interest.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, you're right.
Sorry, Knut, did you have a comment on
Yeah,
that?
sure.
Yeah.
Actually, we look at very long-term variations in wind speeds, and we see that we probably are in a regime right now with relative low wind speeds compared to sort of a very long time series, because we have very long time series measurements of wind data in Europe in particular. Whether that's influenced by climate change or whether this just is a natural fluctuation, we do not know.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you mind just asking it at the microphone so everyone online can hear? And then there was another question after you.
I'm Mike Eckhart. I work at Citibank, but I also teach the environmental finance course here at SIPA as an adjunct professor. So big fan of these guys, particularly Richard and Jason. And Dan. Okay. And all you other guys, too. But really, seriously, I'm a big fan. So I'm going to say something that's very controversial, but it won't be negative. It'll be positive. And that is, we were in this conversation in the late 70s, late 80s, late 90s, and so forth. And the reason is that the discussion is the same, but the content is different. That's advanced, gotten much better. But the discussion is the same because we still have the same 50 regulatory bodies that we had in the 70s. We're still regulated as though this was 1935. We have 50 regulatory bodies, we have 50 markets, and we know this, and we don't talk about it anymore because, you can't do anything about it. I'd like to suggest something that maybe we can do about it because of New York's leadership, Massachusetts, and yeah, we want regional, but that hasn't worked. What we're lacking is national. And the reason we finance one project at a time as they come across our transom is there is no national market. The city can't approach financing of clean energy on a national basis. We just have to wait for the projects to pop up like popcorn. Now, and what I'm going to say is that we're in a loop, I think, where we think in terms of state government, and each state has its government. That's good, fine. And then we have national government, and that comes and goes. But there's a third that's been under discussion for at least 50 years. I'm not the originator of it. And that there really should be a third angle to policy, which is not national government, but national coordination. And that would be a voluntary body where the states can collaborate together with some degree of almost a treaty. The states can't enter international treaties independent. That's that's in the Constitution. You can't do that. But I don't believe there's anything in the Constitution that says California and New York can't collaborate with Texas and Iowa and New Jersey and Massachusetts on advancing national energy policy state by state by getting more like each other. So particularly, Richard, you and I have talked about that a few times, but your thoughts now.
Well, we would welcome that, and there are, not surprisingly, conversations that are going on amongst different states about doing it, and it's interesting because the states you mentioned are not all blue states; they're red states, and so it's interesting when you look around. Texas has got the best competitive markets and a lot of wind, and they've figured out how to socialize the cost of transmission. Georgia's had a really good EV market because the Southern Company wants to sell more electrons, and so it's more. Energy historically in the United States has been a regional issue as opposed to a partisan issue, and so you see that more at the state level. But the one thing that is a challenge, and my background's been before I've been in government, was all the private sector. You say, okay, well, in the private sector, you want to let's get people together and we can start working on this stuff. Well, if you work for the state, almost any state, your ability to travel out of the state is virtually impossible, much less to have the state pay for your out-of-state travel and you stay at a hotel. My goodness. And so it is, it's a real issue. I mean, to be able to even coordinate. So it would be great if we could have some kind of capability to do this, but it goes back to the point about process again. We are actually, whatever, for want of a nail, want of a horse, whatever it is, we would need some financial infrastructure that would even enable us to get senior policymakers together to do it.
So, Mike, I have a halfway house to your vision, which is I think the states should take over the RTOs and the ISOs and use them as a coordinating mechanism. It would require a governance revolution. And if I had a chance to go back and be commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection again, I would go at that issue. And I would seek to displace the current governance model and give the ratepayer the authority to run those organizations and to use them as the regional coordination mechanism. And I think it would allow you to get some distance towards where you want to go by creating regionalization. And I think it would also create a conversation about what best practices look like in exactly what you want. And I'll just pick one example. In the New England ISO, there are capacity markets that are annual. If you can't promise power 12 months a year, you can't bid. In New York's ISO, I believe, Richard can correct me, there's a seasonal opportunity. So if you can produce power in the summer or the winter, but not in the other season, you can bid. I think that's extraordinary. So why has New England not picked that up? These are the kind of little quirks that I think better conversation, comparing best practices, and using that as a governance structure to promote the policy future that we're talking about could be of interest.
Could Columbia and Yale work on that?
No, we'll talk about it. I'd be happy if New York and New Jersey could figure out how to fix the Amtrak tunnel first, and then we could collaborate more broadly. Next, please.
Hello, Elena Crete from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I'm a fan of the whole panel, no favorites. But I am going to pick on Eric and Richard a little bit. We've mentioned the Champlain-Hudson Power Express line a few times, like it's done and it's a successful project, but it's been underway for 10 years and all the permitting is done, but I'm just wondering, is there a timeline for the actual completion of that? And if there's not, what's holding it up?
Good question. Richard.
Well, I mean, the state has taken the position that this is a merchant line, and so it's really up to market participants as to whether or not it's going to be built.
And I think, there's been different approach, overall between the state. There's a Massachusetts RFP right now going on that we're answering by the end of July. And I think to Richard's word, it's a merchant line. We're looking at if there is customer. Customer could be, different party, but we can definitely build this line, in time for whatever needs you have. It's a couple of years It's going to create job. It's about 2,000 jobs being created. You know, we know how much it's going to cost. We know we have the product. I've mentioned the predictability of that project also in terms of cost for the future. So there's a lot of advantages. So I think it's a question of having the conversation and saying, okay, who's willing to sign up for that? And I think we're going to make it happen. We're ready to do that tomorrow morning.
What are the challenges this still faces, Dan?
Well, I think the challenge number one is that there's been a lot of uncertainty. And in order to make that project work, there has to be a buyer on the other end ready to pay for it.
Yep.
And I don't think we have clarity on whether that buyer's ready to go. And you know, I would also say there is some competition for limited clean resources at the current moment. So if I were in Eric's shoes, I would be saying, well, I've got to play off New England against New York here. And if I can get Northern Pass built, and it looks to me like Connecticut and Massachusetts are eager to buy this power, maybe that's my better bet. So I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if I were he, I'd be thinking about that and asking, is New York ready to sign contracts that justify what is, I believe, a multi-billion-dollar investment? Again, it can be spread for a long period of time. The amortization point, we should not forget. That's a critical one. But somebody has to sign up at the outset to make it go.
And clearly that's what's happening in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts have changed the law. They are offering that opportunity right now. We're going to bid. We're not going to be the only one. There's multiple projects also that we are working on right now. Just with New England, there's 3 potential projects. We talked a lot about NPT, but there's others. There is CHPE with New York, and there's also with our sister province. We know we don't talk about Ontario, but Ontario has major needs. You know, they have a lot of nuclear plant to refurbish, and they have to make decision about that. And you know, the thing also with Ontario and Quebec is I have 14 terawatt-hour I can export tomorrow morning. The infrastructure is already in place. So that's, for us, it's, you know, we're waiting for the market to react. But in some places, they already reacted. The law is in place. We're bidding. It's going to happen. So we'll see, you know, after what the other opportunity. But it's a question of having a customer, basically. Yeah.
And I do think, by the way, it's not only waiting for markets. I think it's waiting for policy to guide markets.
Yeah.
And just to reiterate something I said earlier that I think is critical, is creating an energy pricing structure that is energy, capacity, and attribute. And I think that's the key if you really want to get these clean energy projects to go and to get the investment in the infrastructure that makes them go.
Do you want to say anything about transmission more broadly? Knut, no? Okay. Another question there, please.
Thank you.
I'm Grant Van Weingarten, a student at Columbia Business School. I'm also a fan of everyone at the panel, especially Eric, because I'm Canadian. Okay. My question is around battery storage. FERC Order 755, introduced in 2011, was aimed at incentivizing frequency regulation. And since then, PJM dominated in battery storage implementations up until 2015. Are there lessons to learn from what happened in PJM, and can we expect similar actions in other ISOs and RTOs?
Who wants to take that?
I guess I'll take it. I mean, I guess I kind of hinted at this before, which is that, oh boy, I'm going to get in trouble here. There's a difference between economics and business, right? And so I understand the FERC approach, which is an economist's view. But I think when we talk about the need to build the kind of grid that we've all talked about, it has to be more than just thinking about price signals. And there needs to be a change in, as I said, it needs to be a change in business model, changes in processes, change in culture, changes in attitudes. And so that's why we think that it's very important to think about these changes in the utility business model and to create and to change the processes that surround the utilities so that and third parties so that they are changing their business model attitudes and culture. Because it's not just frequency regulation. It's not just storage. We have to have an integrated, we're talking about a flexible, integrated grid. Mm-hmm. And so nobody's going to be smart enough to come up with individual sort of wholesale market products, even if you even imagine that. So that's why, I appreciate it. It was well-meaning. Certainly, New Jersey did a better job than New York in terms of the structure of the market. But I do not believe that we are going to get to where we need to get to with that kind of approach.
Final word to our friends to the north.
Yeah, maybe on batteries. Batteries is we don't talk a lot about batteries, but this is clearly a technology challenge today and a cost challenge probably that we're all facing. Yes, we talk about wind, we talk about solar, but clearly those are variable resources, and I think that the next challenge will be to be able to stock that energy at some point in an environment that is safe. Okay. Because today we know battery can offer some challenges, in terms of safety, and also costly. So storing energy today in a battery is very expensive. So actually, we have a research center where we're developing today a battery that can stock 1.2 megawatt hour and probably last for about an hour for a couple of maybe 1,000 homes or something like that, and it's very safe because it cannot get on fire. So we've developed that. But at the same time, so technology, I think, will need around the world. We're working on it. A lot of other people are to improve, to make these sources, even more, financially okay with what we're looking for. But the other challenge, or the other thing also that I wanted to say is that's why if we're smart in Northeast, if we all look at the network together, we, Hydro-Quebec, can be the battery. Okay, and I'm simplifying here because the reservoir we have, this is our battery. I have miles and miles of waters, that are sitting there waiting. So if we all work, that's a battery, basically, and that's how we've been operating for many years. We need it, and when we need it, it's available right away. So if we're looking at this collectively, I think we could do, and that was my point earlier, we could do much more all together. Then we can use all the wind and all the solar we can produce. And then when there's no sun or no wind, then the batteries, which are the reservoir, can take over.
Can I make it?
Yeah, Knut had a
Very,
comment.
very quickly on that, we believe battery storage is very promising. We're actually piloting a small battery storage with our offshore wind farm up in Scotland. We're installing that on the wind farm side of the grid connection to see how we can optimize both the technical and also the commercial operation of the wind farm, having that battery storage attached to the wind farm. And I think we're going to see more of that. And I think we're going to see that also from large scale, both onshore, offshore, renewable generation plants, intermittent generation plants, that you will see people looking at the possibility of upstream integration of battery storage. And I just, by coincidence, yesterday or today, I just saw a news flash that GE is also now looking at how to integrate battery storage into gas-fired power stations to optimize the commercial operation of that. So battery storage is definitely important.
Vijay, you stand between us and alcohol. Take as long as you want.
Just then 20 seconds. I think on engineering and technology issues, I think the batteries which can guarantee 10-year life on a daily cycle are not yet there at a price point and safety considerations. Mm-hmm. One thing which we need to think about is, just like we are talking about the business model of the grid, I think, and the interesting thing is I've tried this in Africa, and it's, if you can get the battery manufacturer not to charge you the capex, but just charge you by the kilowatt hours you took out of the battery, then you kind of de-risk that battery investment. And I think those kind of innovative models for also the battery deployment could allow newer players who actually believe and claim that they have a much longer life product, to put their skin in the game and say, look, if we don't last 10 years, you don't want to get paid for 10 years. So I'm going to stop there before alcohol.
Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to our panel. We have some hors d'oeuvres, wine and beer, I think, in the back for those who want to continue the conversation. For those who don't, you can follow me to watch the Ranger game somewhere. By the way, New York is currently leading Canada. Ottawa, 1-0, thanks to a goal by the Norwegian Mats Zuccarello. So
Thank you.
we've all been represented in Madison Square Garden this evening. This was a great conversation. I want to thank Richard and Vijay and Dan, Eric, and Knut for being here. Thanks to all of you for being here. Please join me in giving a hand to our panelists.